Okay, great. Good morning. Please be seated. Let me just pray before we open our passage for this morning. Father God, we thank you once again for this time that we have together, that we can worship you through song. And as we come to your word now, I just ask that you would be helping us to be receptive to you. Please be with me as I speak, that my words would be clear, that your message would come through, that anything I say that is distracting would be taken away, Lord, but you would just be working in people's hearts this morning. Just speak to us today, Lord, we ask you. May your spirit be powerfully moving in this place. In your name we pray. Amen. Great, good morning. My name is Keith, for those who don't know me. We're getting into Matthew chapter 8 this morning. It will come up on the screen. If you'd like to turn in your Bibles to that, we'll read there first. So this is Matthew chapter 8. We're just doing the first 4 verses. So it says this: When he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. So every time Clayton gets up here, he kicks off with a military explanation. We've learned a lot about Napoleon. If I could name some other military people, then I would do. I tend to start off with nothing that's as exciting as that, but as you know, I'm a teacher. Not for too much longer, I'm happy to say. So my illustrations often revolve around that. And this week, we've had a very exciting kind of student council elections going ahead. This is for the position of head boy and head girl, which I hope makes it sound like I work at a magical kind of Hogwarts kind of place. It's not that important, but the students get excited. It's for the oldest students. They kind of head up the student council. They're meant to be the student leaders who are kind of meant to be the connection between the staff and the students. And they create these videos. They go on these like mini campaign trails around the school. And basically, it's just a couple of weeks of them promising things that are never, ever going to happen. They're promising that there's going to be pizza every class time. They're promising that they're not going to have to wear uniforms. They're promising that there's going to be longer, extended breaks. All these things that ultimately are never going to come to pass. But all the students get quite excited. They go around to all the kind of 6, 7-year-olds, and they're all kind of chanting their names. And for a little while, they have this kind of crowd of followers who are going along with their message. And we see this even in the kind of political arena. As candidates are announced and they go out on the campaign trail, that initial excitement really exists. As a listener, you're listening for the things that you want to hear. And so often there can be some kind of misconceptions. So you might have your favourite kind of idea politically that you want to hold on to, and as soon as a candidate you like kind of mentions anything close to that, you kind of hook onto that. And that's your thing, that's what you grab hold of. And inevitably what happens is quite soon after that, when that person comes to power, there's a realisation that, oh, actually they're not going to fulfil everything that they've promised. There's going to be some kind of letdown. Sometimes that is the fault of the candidate themselves, that's the fault of the person who's put themselves forward, not able to keep their promises. But sometimes that is because we were expecting a little bit too much from them, or maybe we misunderstood, or maybe they had said one thing and we kind of just latched all our hopes onto that little aspect. Well, here what we see, we've just finished the Sermon on the Mount. I'm reluctant to use the word manifesto, but Jesus has kind of given his manifesto for what the kingdom of God will look like. He's laid out everything that he believes the kingdom of God should be, and he's been correcting a lot of what the Pharisees have been saying. He's been correcting their teaching. They've distorted a lot of the law and the Old Testament, and Jesus is correcting them, and he's set out his manifesto. And what we see here in verse 1 is that as he came down from the mountain, great crowds were following him. He's given this speech, he's given this teaching, and people are excited and people are following. But why were they there? Now obviously we can't go into the hearts of every single person, But we can probably have a guess a little bit of why some people would have been following. Just before the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 4:23, we see this that is said about Jesus. And he went through all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. I'm sure there are some people who were there just because they wanted to see some miracles. They'd seen what he'd done before, they'd seen these miraculous things, and they were just kind of excited to be along for the ride. Maybe some people just liked the fact that Jesus was kind of sticking it to the authorities, to the religious authorities. Everything that he said was kind of undermining what the Pharisees had been teaching. Maybe there were people in that crowd who had kind of become fed up with that. They didn't like the authority that was being placed over them, and Jesus seemed to be sticking it to them, and that was what they were kind of relying on, is Jesus is going to come in, he's going to reorder the religious organization. We're finally not going to be the ones who are down-pressed, we're going to be the ones that rise to the top. Or maybe they took from his words, they understood or they misunderstood this ushering in of a new kingdom. They saw this as, this is going to be the eradication of the Roman rule. Jesus is bringing in a new political ideology, he's bringing in a new way that we as Jews are going to be able to live. Or maybe people just follow the crowd. I don't know if you might have found yourself in this situation before. I think it's quite a common thing if you've ever been to Yellowstone National Park. It's basically like Disney, but as a national park, you just drive around hoping to see animals. I'm pretty sure this is something that happens where someone will spot a bison or elk or some other creature. Cars pull up, they see it, and they stay there for a bit. And obviously, as you're driving around, you're very excited when you see a group of people gathered together, because you know if there's a group of people gathering, there must be something interesting to see. So you pull up alongside them, you watch, and then the animal walks away. But by that time, a crowd has gathered. And so the next car that comes along, they see a crowd, they get out, and they're looking for this animal that has already left. And so you have this this situation where the crowd is just self-perpetuating. There's nothing there to see, but people are just excited to follow the crowd. It's why we went to Nashville a couple of years ago, and there's like this hot chicken place, which is going to be really, really good. And we lined up outside for like an hour just to go. And that was partly because, well, there's a crowd, it must be good. It basically tasted like every other hot chicken place you've ever been to. But crowds can do that. The problem with crowds is that you can just kind of get swayed along, and you just move with the motion of the crowd without really having any control yourself. It's not a conscious decision, you're just moving with the flow. My favourite soccer team, Liverpool Football Club, one of the stands there, one part of the stadium is called the Kop. And back in the day, I mean long before I was around, but there used to be no seats, just used to be purely standing. And you can watch video clips from 30, 40 years ago, and there'd be 30,000 people just on a single tier stand, all just kind of crammed in. And if you watch some of that footage, as a goal is scored, you'll just see the whole kind of swell of the crowd just move. And it looks like the ocean, it looks like a wave, as people just move and they have no control over where they're going. But that's the problem with crowds. When we find ourselves in a crowd, we're not necessarily following our own decisions and our own choices, we're just going with the flow. Jesus had lots of people at this time. There was a crowd that was following him. But as we go through the gospel, we'll see that time and time again, people will reject him and they will move further away from him. And actually, by the time we get to the crucifixion, and we see this in Luke 23, I've got a couple of verses here. It says a large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. At the end of Jesus' life on earth, he'd started off with crowds and crowds of people. By the time we get to the crucifixion, there's just a few people left standing who stood by him. And I thought about just people in my life. If any of you have been a Christian for any amount of time really, I'm sure you can think back to people who have kind of stood with you in the crowd, people who have been with you on your walk of faith, who are no longer there, people who would no longer call themselves Christians. I kind of thought about myself, when I was at college back in England, there was something called the Christian Union, which I think you have something similar here, kind of like Christians on campus, and your whole kind of aim and mission is actually very similar to what we have here, to make Jesus known on campus, to know Christ and to make him known. And there was people who I served with at this Christian Union. We organised, we kind of had different leadership positions, but there was people who were part of that team who I know now are just no longer walking with the Lord. People who I went alongside, who we'd be preaching the gospel to other university students who are no longer there. And some of the people who have almost had like some of the most positive influences on my life. I remember there was one guy who I was at a youth group with, he's the same age as me, at church I used to go to. And he was the most passionate person for the gospel. He just loved to tell people about Jesus. There was one time that kind of sticks in my mind. I don't know, this isn't an ideal situation, but he did like to go out, in the evenings, which is fine. I just remember he used to tell me the next morning he was just so excited about the 3 hours he'd spent in the bathroom talking to random people that he was meeting and telling them about Jesus. And he was so excited for that. And now, I hope and pray that there is still something there in his heart deep, but as far as I can tell, he has rejected Christ at this point. There are people who maybe we've stood alongside in the crowd, but they are no longer there. And so, I just think there's a question for us. Why are you here this morning? Now, I know a massive crowd has not swept us in here. We are relatively small in number. But that influence can still come, whether it comes from family or friends. Just think about, what was your motivation for coming? Is it just because, well, this is what I've always done? This is what my family's done, that's why I'm here. Maybe just the fact that we're in Texas, this is just what I do as a Texan. I go to church, we're Christians, we're a Christian nation. This is where we go to. It's very easy to simply go through the motions. And I have to check myself time and time again for this. I go through the motions week to week. I know I'm going to church, I try and go to Bible study on a Wednesday, don't always make it, can't always get there. But you just you're on this treadmill almost, or you can slip into this kind of habit of just going along. Now, obviously it's good to have these habits. It's good to form habits. It's good to have people around you who are going to encourage you to go to these things and to read the Word and to listen to the Word. But if that is the only reason that we're going, then I think that is a troubling place. Because what happens when the rubber hits the road? What happens when things come up? Where suddenly the crowd starts to disappear. You start facing persecution. So there were people, in Jesus' life, even right close up to the crucifixion, where people started to abandon him because they were worried for their own safety. They maybe believed in Jesus, but as soon as persecution was there, as soon as their lives were in danger, as soon as imprisonment was kind of on the cards, they disappeared. Or maybe when the demands of the Christian life become a bit too much. Maybe you feel like it's too demanding on your finances, on your time. Well, there's a story of the rich young ruler who, when Jesus told him to give everything, he went away sad. He wasn't prepared to do that. Or maybe if you're just like some of the people here who were just hoping to see miracles and see healings, or maybe when illness strikes, when death comes in the family, you're prepared, or you consider just packing it all in at that point. Like I said, it's not that we shouldn't have good influences in our lives. And in fact, as Wes kind of talked about last week, as we're summing up the Sermon on the Mount, this is your life, your faith is a community project. We are designed to be in church together. I encourage you wholeheartedly to make this your home, to make a church your home, a local church, because we need each other to strengthen one another. But we also need to just rely on Jesus and don't just get sucked into that crowd mentality of just going where the crowd is, because ultimately people along the way will abandon Jesus, but you want to stand firm. So we've heard Jesus' manifesto. That's what we've seen in the Sermon on the Mount. And now there's kind of this lingering question, okay, well, is he going to live this out himself? Is he going to fulfill these promises? And so we go into verse 2 of chapter 8. And the very first thing that happens in Matthew's Gospel, it says, "And behold, a leper came to him." Now I'm going to have to read a little bit here, because I can't remember all this knowledge, but I was interested in, okay, well, what is a leper? We probably have an idea of that, and I think the first thing that comes to mind is actually what is more commonly known as, or maybe is more technically known as, it's called Hansen's disease. This is the leprosy that we maybe think of. This is an infection caused by slow-growing bacteria called Mycobacterium leprae. And apparently it's still very prevalent. I didn't actually know this, but it's still very prevalent in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And it's a disease of the nervous system. So I think that's what I often think about with leprosy. It's that sense of you lose sensation, and so then you're in danger of hurting yourself. You can leave your hand in the fire, and you don't know that you've left it there, because you don't feel the pain sensation. And there's even instances of people with leprosy falling asleep and rats eating fingers because they just didn't know it was happening. Its symptoms start in the skin and peripheral nervous system, then they spread to other parts such as the hands, feet, face and earlobes. Patients with leprosy experience disfigurement of the skin and bones, twisting of the limbs, and curling of the fingers to form the characteristic claw hand. Facial changes include thickening of the outer ear and collapsing of the nose. Obviously an awful, awful disease. Now, when we see leprosy in the Bible, it might be talking about that. That's kind of like the common type of leprosy that we know. But leprosy in the Bible kind of covered a broader range of skin afflictions. And so although we don't know the specific kind of physical issue that this person had when he came to Jesus as a leper, we do know what some of the social implications would have been for him. Because in Leviticus 13, it talks about leprosy generally, it says, "Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp." These days, I think if I was to tell you, I went to the doctor this week, you probably wouldn't ask me what for. That's kind of generally seen as a bit of a rude thing to do, maybe. But here, you're told if you have leprosy, not only can anyone ask you about it, you've got to go down the street shouting, "Unclean, unclean." I think ringing a bell, warning people that you have leprosy, that you are contagious, that you need to keep away from that. And so when we read this in Leviticus, it seems very harsh to us that these people are kind of shunned out and shut out of the community. But firstly, the purpose was to protect the community from the disease. And apparently even when there was outbreaks of leprosy in Europe and in the Middle Ages, the Jewish communities who kind of held to these laws and kept people with leprosy out, they actually had a much better rate of people not getting infected with leprosy because they held to those laws. So firstly, the purpose of that was to just keep the community safe. But also the hope was that these people would recover and they would be brought back into the community. This cleanliness that was talked about was not necessarily like a moral issue. It was just the fact that ceremonially they were unclean. And that meant it kept them out of their community, and perhaps more importantly, it meant that they couldn't go to the temple. In the Old Testament, that was where God figuratively resided with his people, and that was where the priest would go to meet with God face to face. And if you were unclean, and there's lots of things that could make you unclean, that you could be kind of washed on and go through the processes to be made clean, but if you were unclean, you could not go to the temple, and you could not meet with God in that specific case. And anything that you touched, or anyone that you touched, if you had leprosy, would become unclean as well. According to Jewish law and customs, one had to keep 6 feet from a leper. If the wind was blowing toward a person from a leper, they had to keep 150 feet away. The only thing more defiling than contact with a leper was contact with a dead body. In the Middle Ages, I know this is obviously not in Jesus' time now, but just to kind of show you kind of the thoughts around it. If a man became a leper, the priest donned his garments, took his crucifix, and brought the man into the church and read the burial service over him. For all human purposes, the man was dead. So although, like I said, we don't know the physical, we don't know if it was Hansen's disease that he had, but we do know what his standing was in the society. He was completely cast out. He had nothing to do with the rest of the community. Walking into that crowd would have been a crazy thing to do. And coming face to face with Jesus, someone of religious importance, a rabbi, a teacher, he could be making other people and other things unclean. And for all these reasons, when we see leprosy here, we really do see the model of sin and its effects. This is really a picture for us. When we see this, we can look and we see the power of Jesus in healing a leper. We see Jesus' dominion over sickness and kind of the nature of what it means to be a human. But really, this is a picture of sin for us. It's something that corrupts you from the inside out. In the same way that leprosy damages the nerve endings, sin corrupts and attacks from the inside. And the more sin takes hold, the more numb you become to it. And I think we've probably all experienced this. There's certain sins that maybe we struggled with in the past, or struggling with now. And the first time you partake in it, maybe it's a shock even to yourself. You feel guilt, you feel remorse. But as time goes on, you become more and more numb to it, and eventually it's just part of your daily routine, your weekly routine, whether that is sexual sin, whether that is gossip, maybe you hold a judgmental heart, maybe there's selfishness. These things that you know are wrong, but you just become numb to its effects. And like leprosy, like these skin diseases, just in the same way that if a leper touched someone, they became unclean, sin can be contagious as well. It impacts those people around us. On Wednesday night Bible study, we talked about that. What is the impact of sin, not just on yourself, but on other people? And again, I think we can all think of instances, maybe in our families, things that have happened where sin has taken place. And it's not just had an effect on them and an individual, maybe it's had an effect on you and the people around you, kids. Other people are hurt and impacted by your sin. And essentially, sin makes you dead. Although you are alive, the sin that you have essentially makes you dead. So do you view your own sin that way? Is that the way that you feel about your own sin? I imagine we think about other people's sin. It's easy to point the finger at other people and you see the deadly impacts of their sin, and it's easy to point out the flaws and the faults. But do we look at our own sin? Do I realise that in this story, I am the leper. You are the leper. You are the one who is sick from the inside because of the impact of sin. So I just encourage you, kind of looking at this to begin with, not to take a casual view of sin and allow it to start rotting you. That animosity, the bad feelings that maybe you hold against other people, that is not healthy for you. That is not healthy for the relationships that you have. That is not healthy for the church. Deal with that. Deal with that animosity. Do your conversations just turn to gossip? Maybe it starts off well-intentioned. Maybe you're looking out for them and their spiritual well-being. But does it just turn into gossip? The things that we watch, the things that we listen to, are we careful about those things? Do we see anything bad in them, which can kind of lead to a rotting of our insides, or do we take action against it? So it's also interesting. So I want us to think about that the sin inside us we need to not take lightly. We ourselves are the lepers, but I think we could also think about, well, how do we treat other people? who are sinners, who are lepers at the same time. As a result of leprosy and its effects on people, it followed almost universally that society and religious people scorned lepers. Rabbis especially despised them and saw them as people under the special judgment of God. So in Jesus' time, rabbis sometimes boasted about how badly they treated them. They bragged about the fact that they refused to buy even an egg on a street when he saw a leper. Another boasted that he threw rocks at them when he saw them. Now that is obviously taken to its extreme, and we can hopefully see that is a distortion of the word of God. That initial intention of the person with leprosy being taken out of the community was there to protect the community, and the hope was that they would always be made clean and restored. But what we see here from the religious leaders is those people who have been cast out is then an opportunity to throw rocks. And we've probably all been guilty of this at some points, that when we see sin in other people, whether they are celebrities, well-known, religious leaders, or maybe just people that we know within our own community, when we see sin, when we see failing, our first reaction isn't necessarily to mourn and to want restoration. Maybe we see it as just an opportunity to throw rocks and malign those people even more and go, well, yeah, I always knew that about them. That is what they're going to be like. Maybe we almost get our identity from not our own community, but how badly can we treat others. And my religiousness, my faith is going to be measured by how badly I treat the outsiders, because that makes me look holy and that makes me look secure in my faith. That isn't what our attitude should be. When we see that, we should long for restoration. We shouldn't be using that as a tool to divide and to separate people. We don't want to be the ones throwing rocks at other people, because we too were once a leper. We were the ones who needed to come before Jesus. And so that's where I want to go now. So as we move on to the second half of verse 2 and verse 3, let me just read that again. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. So, like I said, I'm not going to be a teacher for too much longer. I'm quite excited about this. Just got a couple more weeks. I have been looking for new jobs and not just completely quitting and doing nothing, as much as I would love for Chloe to support me. Don't think that's going to happen. So I went through a process. I've only done it a few times, actually. I've only ever really had a few jobs. And so I had to write my resume, which I'd never written an American resume before. They are a little bit different, so I got a bit of help from some other people just in terms of layout and what it should look like. I don't like writing them, because you obviously have to sell yourself. You have to write good things about yourself. And to me, I don't know if it's a cultural thing, it just doesn't come across. I don't find that very easy to do. I know I'm great, but I don't necessarily want to write it down. But you're in that resume, you're making a case for yourself. You're trying to show, well, these are my skills, this is what I can do, this is what I'm going to bring to your company, and this is why you should hire me. And the people who are interviewing you and they're looking at that resume, they're obviously getting something out of it as well. But you're looking for, there's mutual beneficial impact from this. The idea is that, look, this is what I'm going to offer you, and in return, you're going to give me some money. That's what I'm after. I need to pay the bills. This is what I want to do. And we might have that same kind of attitude sometimes to our relationships. A little bit of give and take. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And we're looking for that, hey, I'm only going to be friends with you if there's a mutual understanding that we're going to benefit each other in some way. When the leper comes to Jesus here, he knows that he has absolutely nothing to offer him. When we come before God, we might try and offer our good deeds, our skills, our talents, our gifts. We might think, oh, we're an incredibly gifted musician, I can do that in the church, I can speak, I can lead people. These are all things that I can offer to God. I'm going to offer him that, and in return, he's going to bring me into his family, and I'm going to be a good Christian. But the leper knows that he can bring absolutely nothing. And when we come before God, when we come to him in our natural state, rotten to the core with sin, we know that we have absolutely nothing. He doesn't need anything from us. He wants us to serve him. He wants us to offer our gifts. And we do that in a relationship, but that isn't why he saves us. There's nothing that he needs from us. He just says, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. The leper offers nothing, and Jesus demands nothing. He just says, I will be clean. I'm always reminded of the story of the thief on the cross, and it's always an encouragement to me, because we see there a man who's nailed to the cross next to Jesus, and we know that he literally has nothing to offer. He's in his last hours of life, and he's there next to Jesus, and he just asks for Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. And Jesus says to him, today you will be with me in paradise. And that man can do nothing at that point. He's not going to get down from the cross. He can't go get baptized. He can't go tell other people about Jesus. He is there, hanging there, and everything that he is possibly hoping for, he is just resting on Jesus. And that is what this leper is doing here, and that is all that we can do. Sometimes we might be made especially aware of our weakness. Like I said, even these last couple of weeks, I don't know, I shared with a couple of the guys just earlier in the week. I'm here, I'm trying to help lead a church. There's ways in which I know I'm not doing that particularly well. And I'm just becoming more and more aware of my weakness. Being married has helped do that as well. You become aware of your faults, your flaws. Coming alongside other elders and trying to kind of lead a church, you just become more and more aware of, oh man, I'm really not offering a lot here. And although that is discouraging to my soul sometimes, because obviously we want to offer, we want to serve, at the same time, maybe it's not a terrible place to be. Because the people in that crowd who were there, who saw the leper coming, they were in the same position as the leper, really. They also had nothing to offer. They also needed Jesus to make him clean, but maybe they just weren't aware of it. Whereas the leper knew. He knew he had nothing. And so maybe those times when you feel discouraged, you feel weak, those are the times when you can go to Christ and you know that actually it doesn't matter. He is still willing. Jesus stretches out his hand and touches him and says, I will be clean. So the man, when he comes before Jesus, he kneels before him as an act of worship. And interestingly, Jesus takes that. A lot of people will say that, Jesus never claims to be God. But whenever anyone worships Jesus, Jesus accepts it. He doesn't rebuke them in any way. This man comes before him, he kneels before him, and Jesus takes that. In some senses, being a Christian requires absolutely nothing. This man came, he didn't have anything to give Jesus. But in other ways, it requires absolutely everything. He knelt before him, he worshipped him, he humbled himself. He had to give everything to Jesus. And that should be our attitude as well. That when we come before Jesus, although we have nothing to offer him, we are giving our whole selves to him. And what was Jesus' reaction to that? Consider the scene. Remember what I was saying about the nature of this disease and what it meant. These people had to walk around shouting, unclean, unclean. They had to stay 6 feet away from people. They were complete outcasts in society. Jesus has just come down. The crowds are following him. This man with leprosy, calling out, unclean, unclean, walks towards him. I'm sure people parted and got out of the way as he walked through. And he comes face to face with Jesus. Other rabbis, other religious leaders are throwing stones at these people. They're making an example of them. They considered them to be particularly judged by God, that they had done something wrong and this was why they were afflicted with their leprosy. And anything this man touches becomes unclean. And Jesus is stood there face to face with him. And Jesus' reaction as the man says, if you will, you can make me clean. Jesus stretches out his hand and touches him. He didn't have to do that. Jesus could have healed him with a word. He didn't have to touch him. This man might not have been, might not have been touched for months or years. I mean, who knows how long he'd had this for. But he reaches out and touches him. And rather than Jesus becoming unclean as a result of the touch, it is the man who is made clean instead. Not only does it demonstrate Jesus' humanity in reaching out, it demonstrates his power as well. And clearly this is a great picture of what Jesus will do on the cross at the end. That he came down from heaven, he didn't need to, but he decided to come down. He reached down to us like he reached out his hand to this leper. And he took on our sin. Rather than Christ becoming unclean, he did become unclean, he took on our sin, but we became clean as a result. So what can we take from that? Well, we've talked about, I've kind of described us as lepers in here. I don't know how that makes you feel. But you are, we have sin. That is our problem. We have sin within us. Whatever you have experienced, whatever sins you feel that you have done in your life, there is nothing that is too great for God to not deal with. He is prepared to reach out to you and to cleanse you and to clean you with no caveats. You don't need to make it up to him. You don't now need to go undo everything. Now we do see like Zacchaeus, who he was healed, he was forgiven of the wrong that he'd done, and he wanted to give back. And he wanted to kind of redo the mistakes that he had made. Well, that might be our reaction, but that is not going to save us. Jesus saves us as we are. There's no caveats. We don't need to do that. There's no sin that he's not prepared to deal with. And God is not a distant God. He came to earth for us. He wanted to be with us. He wants to touch us, to heal us. And so don't let that go unused. Don't let that pass by. This leper took the opportunity. He knew Jesus, he saw him, he followed him, and he went and he was healed. So finally, just in this last verse, and it's kind of a odd one really. Even now, like when I read this, I think this doesn't seem like what it should say. Jesus said to him in verse 4, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them." Our logo, like I said, is to know Christ and to make Christ known. And kind of what I'd like the Bible to say here is that Jesus said to him, "Now go out and tell everyone and spread the good news." That's kind of what we expect to hear. And it's odd, really, that it says, when we first read this, like, why is Jesus saying don't tell anyone? Surely you want people to know that you can do this. You want your fame to spread out and for people to hear and to come and be saved, to be made clean, to be healed. That's why he came. Jesus came to give his message. And why is he now telling this man, don't say anything to anyone, but go straight to the priest? Well, there's maybe a few different reasons for this, and maybe something to consider and kind of look at. But I think the main thing we see is that Jesus' main aim at this point was not to gain a reputation for himself. He wasn't someone who wanted to be known just for his miracle working, to be known simply as a wonder worker, or people who saw him as someone who was coming to overthrow the government, to overthrow the Roman rule, to kind of be pressured and pushed in that direction. Jesus' priority was that this man would be made right with God. That he would go to the priest, offer the gift that is commanded to them, and his relationship with God would be right. That place that he had been separated from, the place that he couldn't go because of his leprosy, was now dealt with. And even though the physical affliction had now been gone, the priority was to go to God, to go present himself and be made right there. Jesus came to die. He didn't come to trounce the Romans or to upheave the religious establishment. He came for sinners. He came to make sinners clean. And for us here, if we are still in that situation, if we have not been made right with God, then that call is still there for us today. So I'm going to pray. We're going to come around the Lord's table and we're going to see the culmination of this in the bread and in the wine.